Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to talk about smartphones. Now I've been obsessed with smartphones from a very young age, and I've used all of the major operating systems that existed for smartphones from the 2000s up till now. So today I want to take a look back at every single smartphone that I've ever owned. So, roll intro. And let's get started. Now, talking about technology in general, when I think I was 6 years old, my dad gave me his old Motorola StarTAC. Now, it didn't have any service left on it because it was his old phone, and as a 6-year-old, I didn't need a phone. But all I could do on it was just press the buttons and see the numbers appear on the screen. It was just a single line, and there was nothing really fun to do with it, but from that point on, I was enamored with all things technology. Later on, I inherited his old Cassiopeia and a compact iPad, and both of those were pocket PCs. Now, my very first cell phone was a generic T-Mobile flip phone with a camera, but after that, I got my very first smartphone. Now, we're going to break this down into 3 time frames. The first one being 2005 through 2011, and then 2011 through 2018. 2018 through 2022. The reason I'm doing that is because in those time frames, I generally only used one OS, with a couple instances where I might have deviated slightly, but then gone back to that main OS in that time frame. Now, first, before we get started, I do want to give a few shout outs up front. My dad is the one who gave me my love of technology and handed down a lot of his phones to me. Then after that, I want to thank my uncle David, who actually gave me a bunch of other smartphones during this period because he was working at Microsoft at the time and had access to a lot of phones. And finally, I just want to mention XDA Developers. It's a website where a lot of modders and developers have come together to create a community of modding and changing the operating systems on phones. So, for example, some of my Windows phones I was able to put Android on, and some of my Android phones I was able to upgrade to versions of Android that were not necessarily officially supported for those phones, or stock Android versions when the original phone came with a heavy bloatware and a different UI version. So I just want to mention those 3 things up front. My dad, Uncle David, XDA Developers. All fueled my love of smartphones. All right, let's start with the first time frame, and that's 2005 through 2011. Now, in this time frame, I almost entirely used Windows Phone, or as it used to be called, Windows Mobile. We'll start with the Samsung SCH i730. So as my very first smartphone, I was really proud to have this phone. It was a brick. You could probably build a house out of a bunch of these. It was a slide up phone, so you could slide the screen up and there would be a full QWERTY keyboard underneath. And while everybody else had razors, I had a smartphone. So they could all flip their phone open and have it really cool and thin and fit in their pocket. But I had the internet in my pocket. It wasn't a great internet, but it was way better than what you could get on a razor. Windows mobile phones at the time were separated into a few categories. You had Windows Mobile smartphones, which were phones that did not have a touchscreen, but typically had a full keyboard, with a few exceptions. Then you had Windows Mobile Professional, which were smartphones that had a touchscreen and used the Windows Mobile operating system. And then you also had Windows Mobile Pocket PCs, which were using that operating system but did not have cellular capabilities. So this falls under the Windows Mobile Professional line. Next up, I had the HTC S310. So this is another hand-me-down from my dad, and this was actually one of the phones that I'm talking about that had Windows Mobile Smartphone, did not have a touchscreen. Now this thing was tiny. It looked like what you'd think of as a burner phone nowadays, with just your typical numbers layout for the buttons and no QWERTY keyboard, and a little rocker for moving around your directions instead of a D-pad. I hung on to this phone for a long time and tested out a lot of XDA Developers OSs on this, and I got it all the way up to Windows Mobile 5, which was really cool to see on this tiny little old phone. After that, I got the HTC Touch. Now, this was a really cool phone that I really wanted to get my hands on as soon as it was announced, and my uncle showed it off to me at CTIA 2006, and I eventually was able to inherit it from him. It was the flagship device to use Windows Mobile 5 at the time, and with the new interface of Windows Mobile 5, it had a much more refined and rounded interface, as well as only having 3 buttons. a single button in the center that was a D-pad, so you could click in all directions, but it was one button. And then it also had a left and a right button. This was one of the first smartphones to shy away from having some sort of keyboard and really focus fully on the touchscreen as your main input. Alright, next up I had the HTC S710. Now this is another one with no touchscreen, but it had a full slide out keyboard. Now this one didn't slide down, but rather slid to the left. After that I got the HTC Touch Dual, which is the same as the HTC Touch, but because people realized that an on-screen keyboard that you had to use a stylus for was pretty much impossible at the time with the tiny screens and only having resistive touchscreens, they added a slide-down keyboard to this one. So, same form factor as the HTC Touch, but a little thicker to allow for a slide-down keyboard. Alright, so what happens when you break your HTC Touch? Then you get sent the HTC S620. So this is the first phone that my uncle actually sent me, and it had a full keyboard layout that you didn't have to slide. It was really thin, and I really liked it at the time, but it was short-lived because my dad handed me down the next phone, which is a very similar form factor, and that's the Samsung Blackjack 2. Now this one was really sleek, had some sharp edges, and a really deep burgundy color, and I really liked this one over the S620 just because of the outer features. The OS was the same though. After this, I got the HTC S730 from my uncle, and this is the very last phone that I had that did not have a touchscreen. This is similar to the HTC S710 that I had previously, with a more refined, almost titanium style look, but still kind of thick because of that slide down keyboard. Alright, so next up is one of my favorite phones that I've had, which is the HTC Tilt. Now I saw announcements for this phone and I was enamored, and I begged my uncle to get me one, and he finally did send me one shortly after they were released. It had a really cool mechanism where you could slide down the keyboard but then tilt up the screen, kind of giving you a mini laptop aesthetic. It had a really nice soft touch keyboard with decently clicky keys and a good screen size for the time. However, that tilt mechanism meant that it was very fragile, so I pretty quickly broke it. After that, my dad handed me down his Palm Treo Pro, which was an interesting phone. It had a very tiny square touchscreen and a full keyboard. It looks like one of the phones that wouldn't have had a touchscreen. It was actually about the same size as my Blackjack 2. However, it did have a touchscreen, and if you flipped it over on the back, it kind of looked like an iPhone 3G, which I really liked, with a shiny black back. It also had a problem with the L in the Palm logo falling out. I don't know if it was just me, but I actually had two of these phones and both of them had the L fall out. After this, I had the HTC Touch Diamond that my dad handed down to me. This was HTC's answer to the iPhone. It had a capacitive touchscreen and an accelerometer, which were things that were found in the iPhone. My dad bought this around the time that he got my mom the original iPhone, and he tried to convince my mom that it was just as good, but it was not. So he handed it down to me when my mom got the iPhone 3G, and he inherited her iPhone 2G, or the original iPhone. Which then brings me to my next phone, which is the original iPhone. So when my dad got an iPhone 3G, then I got his iPhone 2G, or iPhone original, whatever you want to call it. I didn't hang on to it very long because I didn't feel that there was a lot you could do with it, so I went back to Windows Mobile pretty quickly. After that, I got the HTC HD2. Now this is another one of my absolute favorite phones that I've ever had. It had a huge screen for the time at 4 inches, and it had the Windows Mobile 6.5 operating system with an interface that HTC had made to optimize it even further for touch. It also had 3G, which meant that I could make phone calls and surf the internet at the same time, which was just unheard of for the time. And the cool thing about the HTC HD2 is that it is one of the phones that has gotten most love from the dev community, and there have been everything from Android builds, Windows Phone builds, and you've even been able to run Linux and Windows XP on this phone. Windows XP on a 4-inch screen does not work well, but you could still put it there and it was still cool to see it. Next up was the HTC Touch Pro 2. Now this was the last Windows Mobile phone that I had, but not the last Windows phone. This phone was actually the successor to the HTC Tilt, but had an improved mechanism so that when you slid it out and tilted it up, it was less likely to break. So I actually didn't break this phone, which was great. This phone was the first time that I put an Android operating system on a Windows Mobile phone. and that got me really hungry to have a real Android phone after playing around with the operating system and the App Store. But I made one more stop in Windows land before switching over. Alright, so the last phone in this era was the Nokia Lumia 800. Now this was a phone running Windows Phone 7, so this was the end of Windows Mobile that ended at Windows Mobile 6.5 and became Windows Phone at Windows Phone 7. The UI was beautiful. The Metro UI is still praised for its looks, and the flat design is something that Android and iPhone took a while to get to, where they initially had a skeuomorphic design. But now, everybody uses a flat design, like the Metro UI. However, the Windows Phone 7 and subsequent Windows Phone app availability was pretty terrible. There weren't official versions of a lot of major apps that you'd find on Android and iPhone, and the unofficial versions just really didn't run very well. So, it was time to move on. Alright, so we're at the end of the 2005 to 2011 era. I just want to briefly touch on what happened to Windows Phone after this. So Windows Phone continued to exist for a while with versions 8 and 8.1. Between HTC and Nokia and Samsung and then a few other smaller developers, they were able to make a good amount of phones in this era, and some really interesting ones at that. However, it never really could compete with Android or iOS. There even was an effort to kind of merge Windows and Windows Phone, with Windows 8.1 and Windows Phone 8.1 having extremely similar UIs and being fully optimized for touch on the desktop side, and really resembling Windows Phone, where you actually had to kind of dig through the system to get to your old traditional Windows layout. This was eventually changed back to normal a bit in Windows 10, but the Metro UI does still remain within Xbox and Windows 10 and Windows 11 today. Windows Phone is no more, but what it brought to the table as far as design will live on. So now that we're out of Windows land, let's talk about the era of 2011 to 2018. This was almost entirely Android, although there was one little deviation we'll talk about. So my very first Android phone was actually probably the best at the time, and was the beginning of what is now the most popular Android phone on the market, and that was the Samsung Galaxy S. So with the Samsung Galaxy S, you were getting a good-sized touchscreen, multi-touch had already come into its own, and the Android app market was starting to really flesh out. I held on to this for a little bit, but there was another phone that had been released a little bit earlier that I really wanted to try out. So after this, I went over to the Palm Pre 2. Now this was running on Palm's WebOS, and Palm was eventually bought by HP, who made the HP Veer, the HP Pre 3, and the HP Touchstone after the Palm Pre 2. The OS was a little bit slow, but the cards layout of the OS was really cool and influenced a lot of the multitasking that we see today. WebOS did eventually die as a smartphone OS, but was actually put into TVs as a smart TV operating system later on. After that, I went back to Galaxy Land with the Galaxy S2. The huge amount of RAM increased in this versus the S1 was really helpful for all of the games that I was playing, but memory management was still a huge issue with Android at this point, and continued to be an issue throughout my tenure with Android. I actually put a widget called Advanced Task Killer on every single one of my Android phones, right on the home screen in the bottom right corner every time. And anytime that I closed an app, I would go to the home screen and press that task killer to try to free up a little bit of my RAM. Next up, I got the Galaxy Note. Now, this was a really big screen for the time. This was the beginning of the phablet phase of phones, really. And this phone went back to having a stylus like many of the Windows phones that it had previously. However, they tried to market this as not as a stylus, but as a pen that you use to take notes with. But in reality, it was a stylus. It wasn't until later versions of the S Pen that it really became something useful, but the S Pen still can't really compete with the Apple Pencil. After this, I had the Galaxy S3 and then the Galaxy Note 2. Galaxy Note 2 I thought was amazing, and I really thought that my friends envied me, but they probably were just like, why is this guy still on Android? We all have iPhone 4s. Then I went on to the Galaxy S4, and this was actually one of the phones that I was given by my uncle as well. Even though he was working at Microsoft, he was actually able to get Android phones because they weren't making very many Windows phones. So I had this one handed down to me when I broke my Galaxy Note 2. Next up, I had the Google Nexus 4. Now, this is actually the first phone that I ever bought myself, brand new, And this was when Google was making the Nexus line before the Pixel line eventually came out. With the Nexus phones, you were getting a fully stock UI. However, the phones weren't actually manufactured by Google. This one was manufactured by LG, but future ones would be manufactured by Huawei or Motorola, with one of the ones that you'll see later on that I had. This phone had a beautiful, almost starry black finish on the back, and it was a glass back, which meant that I did drop it and break the back. However, I bought insurance on this, so I got another one, but then I eventually sold it and moved on. After the Nexus 4, I bought a used HTC One M7. Now this was one of the coolest phones that HTC made for Android, and it had a fully aluminum body and stereo speakers on the front, which made for a great listening experience. As well, there were no buttons on the front, it was just a touchscreen and the speakers, which was something interesting for the time. Next up was the Moto G2. This is another phone that I bought brand new from Best Buy, and I thought it was really cool that you were getting near flagship level features for a phone that was under $200. I held on to this one for a little bit, but then I eventually wanted to get back to that HTC One kind of design, so I bought the HTC One M8. However, though this phone looked really cool and had a more rounded design versus the HTC One M7, I had bought it unlocked on eBay, and it turned out to not be actually unlocked, so when I put my SIM card in it, I could use the phone and I could text, but internet was insanely slow. So I eventually sold this one to somebody who actually had the right carrier for it and moved on. It's important to note that this was one of HTC's last dying breaths. They did make another one after this, the HTC One M9. HTC does still exist today, but nobody knows about them. They are not the juggernaut that they once were when Windows Mobile was the king of smartphones. HTC did announce that they are planning to make a new high-end Android phone at some point this year, and that it'll have metaverse features. I'm not sure exactly what that means for a smartphone. As well, HTC did make a VR headset that sold pretty well, but again, they're just not the titans that they once were. The same thing happened to another manufacturer, Nokia, who rested on their laurels like HTC and got complacent and stopped innovating as much as companies like Samsung. After the One M8, I got the Google Nexus 6. Now this one was manufactured by Motorola and actually took its design cues from a really popular Motorola phone, the Moto X. However, this phone was huge. It's the Nexus 6 not only in numbering, but in screen size. It was a 6-inch screen, which wasn't really beaten by any main phone until you got to the iPhone XR, and that was 4 years later. So this really held the title for one of the biggest phones for a long time. Again, because it was a Nexus phone, you were getting that stock UI, so you really didn't have to do much to clean it up and remove bloatware like you would with other phones. So I actually didn't do a lot on XDA developers with this phone versus all of the phones that I listed before. I was on XDA developers pretty heavily. After the Nexus 6, there was a Nexus 6P that was made by Huawei, and then after that, we started getting Pixel phones. Interestingly, I'm not sure what they would have done for a Nexus 7 because there was already a Nexus 7, which was a 7-inch tablet. So it kind of seems like the perfect time to switch over the naming from Nexus to Pixel. After this, I stuck with the Motorola design scheme and got the Motorola G5 Plus, and this was my very last Android phone. It's another phone that I bought brand new, got this one from Best Buy, and had that same ethos of a cheaper phone that still had a lot of the flagship features. But after that, I ended up getting my very first iPhone. So that leads us into the next and final era, which is the 2018 to 2022 era. We'll start with the iPhone 6. Now, I got an iPhone 6 pretty well after its initial release. When I got it, it was because my sister had gotten the iPhone 10. So after the iPhone 6, there was a 6S, 7, 8, and then the 10 at the same time as the 8. So she got the 10 a little bit after it was released, and then I inherited her 6 because I begged her to give it to me as a Father's Day gift instead of just selling it to recoup some of the costs from her iPhone 10. She relented and gave it to me, and it was my very first iPhone, and I still hung on to the Moto G5 Plus and switched back and forth a little bit. However, when I got my next phone, the iPhone 6S, I did finally sell my Moto G5 Plus. So with the iPhone 6s, I actually bought this from a coworker, and it had a broken screen when I bought it. And I had looked up some tutorials on how to fix iPhone screens before buying it. It looked like something that I could do pretty easily, so I bought a screen, replaced it, and that was the beginning of my repairing iPhones. And I actually repaired a lot of phones for friends at the time. But once iPhones moved into having the full glass and no home button layout, I stopped repairing them because I did not feel comfortable with that repair design. And the screens at the time were retailing for well over $100, so I didn't want to have somebody spend $100 on a screen only for me to not be able to actually replace it effectively. I would like to go ahead and try that eventually with maybe somebody's old iPhone 10, so that it's not an expensive screen, and if I'm repairing it and I mess up, then I can easily replace the part. But if it's a $100 screen, like it was back then I'd really rather not do it. After the 6S, I did buy an iPhone 7, which I think I hung on to for maybe 2 weeks before buying an iPhone 8 Plus from a friend. And I hung on to that for a few months, but I eventually walked into an Apple store and traded it in for an iPhone XR. That iPhone XR in red was the first time that I had one of the new design iPhones with the full glass screen and no home button, and I held on to it for a while, but as soon as the iPhone 12 Pro Max was announced, I knew I had to get my hands on it. I was just getting into photography at the time, and I knew that the IBIS would be really helpful for my phone photography as well as some videography. So I traded in my iPhone XR, got the iPhone 12 Pro Max about a month after it was released, and that is the phone I still have today. I also did buy a DJI Osmo Mobile 3 gimbal for use with my iPhone 12 Pro Max, and I still do use that for a lot of B-roll when I have video B-roll versus just photo B-roll. I didn't really feel the need to upgrade to the iPhone 13 Pro Max when that was announced. Cinematic mode I thought was kind of silly. I'd rather pull focus on my own using Filmic. And some of the other features are cool, but I'd really rather wait for the second gen version of those features that'll come out with the iPhone 14 and the 14 Pro Max. So that's what I'm looking forward to. We'll see if all the rumors pan out and if it ends up finally ditching the notch. If it does have all the things that are rumored, or at least some of them, I'm probably going to finally upgrade my 12 Pro Max. But that'll be about 2 years with a 12 Pro Max, which is the longest I've ever held on to one phone. So we'll see. So that is every smartphone I've ever owned. Now, since I switched to iOS after I sold my Moto G5 Plus, I have not switched to any other operating system. Not only have I not switched to any other operating system, I've gone fully into the Apple ecosystem. I now have a MacBook, I have an iPad, I have an Apple Watch. I had AirPods, although I actually recently changed to the Beats Fit Pro, which I might do a review for in another video. I had the AirPods Pro, I lost them, I think they got stolen, and I ended up getting the Beats Fit Pro on Amazon Prime Day, and they are really, really good. Basically the same as my old AirPods Pro, just without a charging case, and the Find My features aren't quite as good as the AirPods Pro, but the sound is excellent, and I still have active noise cancellation. What am I doing? I'll just review it later. All that to say, I am fully in the Apple ecosystem, and I don't see myself being able to leave even if I wanted to. All right. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's a little bit different than my typical videos, but I just wanted to talk about all of these smartphones because honestly, the idea popped into my head today to make a little list of everything that I've used, and I just fleshed it out into a video. So if you enjoyed this, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any comments or suggestions, or if you want to share what phones you've used and what you're using currently, leave that down in the comment section below, and I'd be happy to start a conversation with you. All right. Have a great one.